Assassin's Creed Odyssey. This game has a lot of aspects to it that are worthy of discussion in their own right. The microtransactions, the bloat, the grind, the new consequential decision-making mechanics, the talented Greek voice actors, the slightly improved combat system, the superb world building, and the intelligent use of 3D assets. However, I would rather talk about the one thing that no one else seems to be talking about: the virtue signaling and modern political filter through which Assassin's Creed Odyssey depicts ancient Greece.
Someone's being hurt. Open this door, or I'll kick it in!
Don't mind her. She likes to watch.
The game has countless female mercenaries and warriors running around. Women are seen on the streets of Athens fraternizing with men, and some of the most politically powerful characters in the game are women. The villages and towns are often crowded with people whose skin is so dark you might think you are in Sri Lanka. Thus, people who play the game and who don't know anything about ancient Greece might be fooled into thinking that the era and region were marked by a prominent sense of equality between the sexes, that the ancient Greek world was a bastion of modern progressive ideals and was full of diversity. But by today's standards, the ancient Greeks might actually be considered misogynists and even xenophobes. Plato, in his work The Republic, stated that, quote, "The relation of male to female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior and ruler to ruled," unquote. Thucydides once said, quote, "The greatest glory for women is to be least talked about among men, whether in praise or blame," unquote. The truth is that in most of the Greek world, women had no legal personhood and were assumed to be part of a household, the oikos, which was headed up by a patriarch called the Kyrios. Until marriage, they were under the guardianship of their fathers or other male relatives. Once married, the husband became the woman's new Kyrios. Moreover, no women ever acquired citizenship in ancient Athens, and thus women were excluded from politics. Aristotle said in his work The History of Animals, quote, "Wherefore women are more compassionate and more readily made to weep, more jealous and querulous, founder of the railing, and more contentious. The female also is more subject to depression of spirits and despair than the male. She is also more shameless and false, more readily deceived, and more mindful of injury, more watchful, more idle, and, on the whole, less excitable than the male. On the contrary, the male is more ready to help, and, as it has been said, braver than the female. And even in malaria, if the sepia is struck with a trident, the male comes to help the female, but the female makes her escape if the male is struck," unquote. Honestly, if you translated this into modern verbiage, it would sound a lot like something off the Rational Male subreddit or a Rollo Tomasi forum. That is to say, it would be a fairly accurate observation of aggregate female behavior relative to men. One-sided and lacking context, perhaps, but accurate nonetheless. Essentially, Aristotle was saying that women are more neurotic and risk-adverse than men, and modern psychometric data on the sexes support this. Now, it is true that Spartan women owned property, fraternized with men, and voiced their opinions in ways that other Greek women could not. But they absolutely took no part in military life. Their lot in Sparta was to make babies and manage the household. The ancient Greek female warrior is a complete fantasy of modern invention. The mythological tribe of warrior women, the Amazons, were, in all likelihood, an exaggerated account of the Scythian peoples of Eurasia, whose women sometimes fought with bows on horseback alongside their men. No one denies that some women fought occasionally under unique circumstances, but the image Assassin's Creed Odyssey paints isn't even remotely rooted in reality. The whole idea of the game's optional female protagonist being a mercenary for hire is simply not credible. Even if we were to grant her an outlier status, virtually no one in the game gives her or her behavior any pause. The way she throws her weight around and asserts herself would have been viewed as extremely unnatural in the Greek world. Ubisoft even has women fighting alongside the Spartans and Athenians in their regular armies. It's almost as if the writers wanted players to believe that this was a typical occurrence. They also use the past tense for the descriptions of female mercenaries in the menus, thereby giving them an air of historicity. The thing about ancient warfare, though, is that physical hand-to-hand combat places the vast majority of women at an extreme disadvantage against men. Women, on average, simply do not have the upper body strength, testosterone levels, dense muscle fiber, and bone structure necessary to withstand the kind of punishment physical combat with men would impose on them. The ancient world wasn't misogynist so much as it was practical. But rather than explore that, Ubisoft's writers opted to gloss over anything that might have offended modern feminist sensibilities. Another example of this is how they portrayed the real-life Aspasia. The game never mentions the fact that Aspasia was what the Athenians called a metic, which basically means foreigner. This was quite important since metics were not allowed to become citizens, nor were they allowed to marry them, and they had to pay a special tax for the privilege of living in Athens. They also never mentioned that Aspasia was a hetera, a type of high-end prostitute. Being a metic and a hetera, Aspasia was free of the legal restraints that normally confined women to their homes, and thus she was allowed to participate in public life in ways normally forbidden to Athenian women. Perhaps as a result of this, many Athenians thought ill of her. At one point, she was accused of corrupting the women of the city in order to satisfy Pericles' sexual perversions. Aristophanes even blamed her for the Peloponnesian War, claiming that the Megarian decree of Pericles, which excluded Megara from trade with Athens or its allies, was retaliations for Megarians kidnapping prostitutes from her brothel. To be fair though, Ubisoft does end up blaming her for the war, but of course they do so by making her the most powerful and influential person in all of the Greek world. Perhaps the worst thing the game does though in terms of deploying modern ideals is that it makes everyone in the Greek world extremely diverse in skin tone. Now to be clear, the people of the Greek world were and are mixed, but not in any modern sense. Greece has undergone several waves of migrations during the last few thousand years, but these were migrations from Central Europe and Anatolia, not Sub-Saharan Africa or the Indian subcontinent. The Greek language itself was brought in by Indo-European peoples migrating south into the peninsula from Western Eurasia. The Greek people, like all Europeans, were, and still are, an admixture of Indo-European migrations and older indigenous groups like the Western hunter-gatherers. They wasn't kings and shit.
These white people be ruining our lives, man. Shit, man, let me tell you, man.
The Pelasgians were most likely the original inhabitants of the Greek peninsula before the classical Greek period between 500 and 400 BCE. While the Pelasgians were not Indo-European, they were still indigenous peoples to Europe, and would not have had skin tones similar to the Dravidian peoples of the Indian subcontinent. Since the end of the Ice Age, the Mediterranean has been relatively warm, but there has never been equatorial levels of UV rays that would have put evolutionary pressure on the Pelasgians to produce higher amounts of melanin in their skin. Recent DNA testing shows us that the ancient Minoans had strong genetic affinities with Bronze Age populations from Sardinia and Iberia, as well as Neolithic samples from Scandinavia and France. Most modern Greeks share a direct lineage with the Minoans and Mycenaeans, who were the precursors to classical Greek civilization, and who were also descended from people in ancient Anatolia, who in turn probably originally came from higher latitudes in Eurasia. What's interesting about Ubisoft's depiction though is that apparently not everyone on the development team got the diversity inclusion memo. The NPCs are all very diverse looking, but the murals, statues, and art in the game reflect a more reasonable and consistent image of the Greeks. We've known for some time now that the ancient Greek statues were actually painted, and we can tell what colors they used via ultraviolet light scans. Most Greeks were slightly darker in complexion than other Europeans further north, but many of these statues had reddish blonde hair and blue eyes. Many people will claim that the ancient Greeks were colorblind and that they discriminated against foreigners based on culture and not ethnicity. The thing is, these assertions go against everything we know about human behavior. We can test and measure in-group preferences and biases in various ethnic groups. We know that babies demonstrate a clear preference toward people who have the same skin tones and facial features as them, and we know that people of one ethnic group tend to show less empathy for people belonging to another ethnic group. SJWs even acknowledge this, they simply use different terminology. Microaggressions. Sure, modern ideas of race probably weren't prevalent in antiquity, but that's not to say that people didn't discern tribal and ethnic identity based on physical phenotypes. The Spartans were practically eugenicists. They were selective about breeding, and they killed male babies that didn't meet their standards. They also made clear demarcations between themselves and the Hella and Perioikoi classes around them, even though they were fellow Greeks. They didn't grant them citizenship, nor did they grant them equal rights. It's doubtful that the Spartans didn't have at least some phenotypic traits that would distinguish them from these other groups after years of selective breeding. What's interesting, though, is that the ancient Greeks actually did speak of distinguishing physical phenotypes. Xenophanes, an Ionian Greek philosopher who lived in the 5th century BC, noted that different peoples believed that the gods looked like themselves. Quote, "Our gods have flat noses and black skins," say the Ethiopians. "The Thracians say our gods have red hair and hazel eyes." Unquote. Even the word Ethiopia is Greek, and it means the land of burnt faces. Generally speaking, though, it seems that there were two main phenotypes in ancient Greece, dark-haired whites and fair-haired whites, as well as gradations in between. The earliest known inhabitants were of the former type. The Minoans and the Pelasgians were dark-haired whites with probably a slightly darker complexion, but again, nothing like Dravidians from the Indian subcontinent. What seems to cause intellectual leftist temper tantrums today is that Greece eventually had an empire that expanded out over large geographic areas. At certain points, it ruled over and influenced other non-Greek peoples, and those peoples ended up speaking Greek. But those people weren't any more ethnically Greek than Israelis today using the English language are ethnically British. I mean, are Anglo-Saxons who learn Hebrew ethnically Jewish? Hippocrates believed, as did many of his contemporaries, that geography and climate played a significant role in the physical appearance and character of different peoples. He once wrote, quote, "Concerning the listlessness and cowardice of peoples, the seasons are especially the cause why Asians are less martial than the Europeans, and more tame in their character. For making no dramatic shift either to the hot nor to the cold, their seasons are temperate. For there are no mental disturbances nor strong change of the body, from which it is more likely that the passion is roused and indulges the senseless and high-spirited, rather than when it is in a steady state. For it is change of everything which wakes the disposition of men and does not allow it to rest. For these aforesaid reasons, it seems to me that the Asian race is weak, and yet further so because of their customs. For much of Asia is ruled by a king, and where men do not rule themselves, nor are autonomous, but are ruled by a despot, there is no reason for them to concern themselves over this, so that they do not practice the military disciplines, but they work to seem pacifistic." Unquote. He went on to note that temperate climates created peoples who were, quote, "sluggish" and, quote, "not apt for labor," while extreme climates led to peoples who were, quote, "sharp, industrious, and vigilant." He also noted that peoples of, quote, "mountainous, rugged, elevated, and well-watered countries displayed, quote, enterprising and warlike characteristics, while peoples of, quote, level, windy, and well-watered countries were, quote, unmanly and gentle." Were Hippocrates a modern political figure, I suspect that he would be called a racist suffering from white privilege, and were statements of his like this public knowledge, I could see folks demanding that all Greek statues be torn down. Interestingly, the Greeks also had strict laws governing the treatment of outsiders. Sparta, for example, had the xenolasia, which was the practice of expelling foreigners deemed injurious to the public welfare. In a very real sense, the Greeks were ethno-nationalists. The very word ethnos is Greek and means people. The Greek city-states didn't grant citizenship to outsiders, and they organized along tribal lines. Aristotle even argued that the natural progression of human beings was from the family to small communities to the polis. Moving on though, another thing that really bothered me about Assassin's Creed Odyssey was its over-the-top portrayal of Greek homosexuality and promiscuity. To be clear, the Greeks certainly had homosexuality as well as pederasty, although scholars dispute the exact nature and extent of it. Pederasty was the relationship of an Arestes and an Eidomenos, i.e. an older male lover and a younger male lover. The general consensus, though, is that older men would take on younger boys as a type of protege. What's in dispute is the exact sexual component to the relationship. But even if the relationship was always sexual, it's worth pointing out that pederasty wasn't exactly a common practice of all Greek social classes. It was mostly reserved for the elites. Moreover, many would argue that pederasty was mostly platonic and served to guide the most gifted boys into becoming the future leaders and aristocrats of the polis they belonged to. By most accounts, the Greeks were hypermasculine and more concerned with what role sexual partners played. Basically, if you got penetrated, you were considered feminine, submissive, and weak. Thus, grown men often had a vested interest in avoiding homosexual relationships in which they took the submissive role. The status quo narrative today often asserts that most Greek men had a basic sexual desire to have relations with other men. But there's a famous Greek play, Lysistrata, in which Athenian women decide not to have sex with their men as a way to force them to stop waging war with Sparta. If most Greek men were able to gain sexual release via other men, then this tactic of sexual denial would not have worked, yet it did. Another object of consideration is that there are approximately 80,000 complete pieces of ancient Attic vases remaining today. In the most influential modern study of Greek homosexuality, Kenneth Dover states that 600 of these vases contain homoerotic themes. Personally, I have little doubt that homosexual tendencies and practices were present in ancient Greece. However, 600 supposed homosexual depictions out of 80,000 vases don't exactly evidence a pervasive homosexual trend. For example, let's say that humanity died out tomorrow, and an alien race visited Earth 1,000 years from now. If they were to review material from Hollywood, Netflix, HBO, and the BBC, they might conclude that the people of the 21st century had a much higher homosexual population than ancient Greece. Moreover, when Xenophon spoke of Spartan law and customs written by Lycurgus, he said this, quote, "Lycurgus adopted a system opposed to all of these alike, given that someone, himself being all that a man ought to be, should in admiration of a boy's soul endeavor to discover in him a true friend without reproach, and to consort with him. This was a relationship which Lycurgus commended, and indeed regarded as the noblest type of bringing up. But if, as was evident, it was not an attachment to the soul, but a yearning merely towards the body, he stamped this thing as foul and horrible, and with this result, to the credit of Lycurgus be it said, that in Lacedaemon, the relationship of lover and beloved is like that of parent and child, or brother and brother, where carnal appetite is in abeyance," unquote. It's quite interesting that Sparta took this attitude, considering that Spartan men and women married between the ages of 18 and 20. Athenian women, on the other hand, often married as young as 14 to a man in his 30s, once he had accumulated enough wealth. Thus, it seems plausible that Athenian men may have been more sexually deprived than their Spartan counterparts, and thus, they might have altered the practice of pederasty to make it a sexual substitute. In fact, the Spartans had very different words for erastes and eromenos, isnelos meaning inspirer, and aitis meaning listener. To be clear, I don't deny homosexuality in ancient Greece, nor do I have a problem with homosexuals today. I'm merely questioning the assertion that homosexuality was universally praised and idealized back then, and even if it was, nothing scholars say or argue today on either side of this debate appears to parallel modern conceptions of a gay utopia. And yet that's what Ubisoft has more or less done in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Grown men in Greece would not have engaged in open homosexual relationships, and yet the game gives you several opportunities to do so, as if this was perfectly normal. There was one character in particular in the game who was absolutely relentless in his homosexual advancements, Alcibiades. Despite having refused him multiple times when playing as Alexios, the game kept pushing his sexuality onto me. It felt very forced, and were someone to do this to me in real life, I might consider it harassment. Perhaps nothing to press charges over, but I would probably make it a priority to start avoiding them. What's more is that when Alcibiades wasn't making sexual advancements, he was making constant sexual innuendos.
I enjoy other physical exertions from time to time.
Sure. Who do you think will win the most race this year?
I will!
Athens will surely rise to the occasion.
I say Messinia!
He even went as far as to craft a dildo and have me hand deliver it to someone, which was admittedly hilarious.
Is this some kind of joke? This is a cast of someone's dick. What's this engraving? This is for your wife, Thalia, for when she starts to miss me.
Again, I admit that it was really amusing, but coupled with the rest of his behavior, it was a bit much. It really appeared that Ubisoft wanted me to have sex with him, and that reeks of ulterior motive, not player choice. In today's socio-political landscape, it doesn't appear to be enough that we openly accept homosexuality. We must also partake in it, lest we be accused of being homophobic.
Stop fighting me! Just let this happen. Get off of me!
Now, according to historians, Alcibiades seems to have been quite the active bisexual, but two modern psychologists have attributed his behavior to someone suffering from psychopathy. He defected from Athens to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, and then back to Athens eventually. By all accounts, he was quite self-serving and treacherous. Coupling this fact with how ancient Greeks frowned on passive homosexual roles, it seems more plausible that Alcibiades was more akin to a hyper-masculine prison inmate than he was akin to a modern flamboyant bisexual. In general, the game also acts as if Greek men and women were extremely promiscuous and unfaithful, or rather that promiscuity was socially acceptable. There's a woman you can sleep with after you learn she is already in a relationship with another man. What's more is, you can sleep with him afterwards if you want to also. Then there's another instance in the game where a mother asks you to train her daughter, and you have the opportunity to seduce and sleep with her. The thing is, ancient Greece had laws like moikeia that forbid men from seducing noble women who were under the protection of a kyrios. Sure, men were free to have sex with slaves and prostitutes, even if they were married, but not noble women under the protection of a kyrios. In fact, if the adulterer was caught in the act, they could be summarily executed by the kyrios without a trial. People will say here that this was a Spartan woman, and they might also highlight the following statement attributed to Lycurgus by Xenophon. Quote, "He observed, however, that where an old man happened to have a young wife, he tended to keep a very jealous watch on her. So he planned to prevent this too by arranging that for the production of children, the elderly husband should introduce to his wife any man whose physique and personality he admired. Further, should a man not wish to be married, but still be eager to have remarkable children, Lycurgus also made it lawful for him to have children by any fertile and well-bred woman who came to his attention, subject to her husband's consent." Unquote. Now, this is a very interesting and divisive aspect of Spartan life for scholars. Some argue that it suggests promiscuity, but does it? Does it say that women were free to have sex with whomever they desired, regardless of their marital status? Does it say that Spartan men could seduce Spartan women at will, absent any consequences? That would essentially null and void the concept of marriage, and we know that Spartans definitely believed in marriage, as well as the family unit. One also ought to consider that Spartan men and women typically married at similar ages, so in general, there may not have been too many older men marrying younger women. Lycurgus may have simply been addressing a rare but important set of circumstances. Concerning the very concept of adultery in Sparta, Plutarch, a Greek biographer of the 1st century AD, had this to say, quote, "The freedom which thus prevailed at that time in marriage relations was aimed at physical and political well-being, and was far removed from the licentiousness which was afterwards attributed to their women, so much so that adultery was wholly unknown among them." And a saying is reported of one Giradas, a Spartan of very ancient type, who, on being asked by a stranger what the punishment for adulterers was among them, answered, "Stranger, there is no adulterer among us." "Suppose then," replied the stranger, "there should be one." "A bull," said Giradas, "would be his forfeit, a bull so large that it could stretch over Mount Taygetus and drink from the river Evrotas." Then the stranger was astonished and said, "But how could there be a bull so large?" To which Giradas replied with a smile, "But how could there be an adulterer in Sparta? Such then are the accounts we find of their marriages." Unquote. Again, people argue that this may suggest a disregard for adulterous behavior, but according to Lycurgus, a married man who was asked by an unmarried man for the use of his wife to bear children was free to reject this request. This at least implies that there would have been consequences for a man and woman who violated the will of the husband. Giradas thus might have been simply emphasizing how faithful Spartans were to their laws and customs, rather than alluding to open promiscuity. That said, the idea that unmarried men were allowed to father children with another man's wife does seem bizarre. Even if the husband gave his blessing, it sounds like pure cuckoldry. On that note, it's worth mentioning that many scholars have called into question the accuracy of Plutarch's second-hand knowledge of Spartan customs. Plutarch was writing in the 1st century AD, long after the decline of Sparta. Moreover, the sources he used have been lost to time, thus there is no way to confirm or deny his assertions. Now, I'm not a historian, but I would assert that rampant promiscuity would have completely undermined the Spartan institution of marriage, as well as their aim for well-bred men and women. They treated their women so well, relative to other Greeks, precisely because they placed such a high value on their ability to produce strong men. In a society as eugenicist as that of Sparta, why would they allow women to be impregnated by anyone at will, when that pregnancy could potentially be a waste of 9 months? So, to come full circle, the idea that some Spartan girl in training would be allowed to have open sexual relations with the player character doesn't seem to hold up. The Spartans may have very well encouraged a guy like Alexios to father a child with this young woman, but they probably would have regulated the affair, and the woman's Kyrios would have at least been consulted on the matter, according to Plutarch at least. Okay, so it's about time to wrap this video up. To be clear, I don't think it's the job of developers to educate young people, but that said, I don't think they deserve a free pass to mislead young people either. Assassin's Creed Odyssey has a nice Greek veneer to it, but it ends up being little more than a modern feminist push for inclusion in history. One of its 2 lead writers, Melissa McCubry, did an interview wherein she discussed how the storyline wasn't, quote, gendered. But that idea flies in the face of antiquity. The Greek world was consumed by gender, just as the modern world is today. But as always, people will probably overlook this because they just want to have fun.